Introduced between 1964 and 1965, the brake tender was a solution to a problem that only applied to the new lightweight diesel and electric locomotives that were being rolled out across the British Railways network. Built to a lighter weight than their steam-powered ancestors, this meant that they had a comparable pulling power and tractive effort, allowing for the same train weights to be hauled. However, this came at the expense of braking ability. Their lack of ability came from the fact that while steam locomotives could rely on both their driving and tender wheels for braking capacity, the new locomotive designs could only rely on a limited number of smaller diameter wheels. To combat this, British Rail introduced the brake tenders to unfitted or partially fitted trains. These consisted of a train of wagons without automatic brakes to provide extra braking capacity. A total of 122 brake tenders were built by British Rail, so even in their heyday of the late 60s and early 70s, they were not a common sight on the network. 3 prototype tenders would be designed by the Collars Works in Glasgow in 1960 and 1961, and it was due to their successful trials that British Rail placed an order for a further 119 to be manufactured, rounding out the number to 122. British Rail drafted in their own works at York and Stratford, as well as 4 private wagon manufacturers, these being Central, Marcroft, Standard and Derbyshire, to build the fleet. All but 10 had been outshot by the end of 1963, with the final 10 being produced early in 1964. These vehicles would come in at 35.5 tonnes, and each tender was treated as equal to the weight of 3.5 BR standard wagons, and equal in length to 1.5. It was for this reason that brake tenders were not permitted to be loose shunted under any circumstances. They were designed as a low but heavy wagon built onto a former carriage underframe, mounted above a pair of carriage bogies, which provided the tenders automatic brakes. Most use ex-LNER Gresley or ex-LMS coaching stock bogies, with 2 using British Rail bogies. It was around the time that production began that British Rail's infamous Mark I coaches were slowly beginning to make way for the new Mark IIs, and so old coaching stock was often being removed from service all over the network. This rebuilding of former coaching stock kept their costs low, as only their steel plate work was new. Mostly, this was the smooth streamline variant. However, the 10 produced at Stratford followed the style of the original prototype in having a much more angular, riveted appearance likened to a World War I battleship. The Stratford variants also found themselves to be 2 tonnes heavier than their counterparts, coming in at 37.5 tonnes. They were built to be a hollow box, which would later be filled with poured concrete and scrap steel, which by 1964 was in great surplus to British Rail thanks to Beeching's cuts. A particularly heavy unfitted train could see themselves running with 2 brake tenders for extra brake capacity, with 1 at each end of the locomotive. The tenders were designed so that their height would not obscure the driver's vision when propelled or hauled. However, due to their position when propelled, they would obscure the front of their locomotives, and therefore often more than not the train's head code. This led to the tenders receiving 4 lamp brackets at either end to display the head code discs of the train's class when propelled. These tenders had a running speed of 60 miles per hour when pulled, however this was reduced to a maximum of 45 miles per hour when being propelled. Propelling did not just bring around head code issues. A number of incidents occurred where drivers misjudged the lengths of their tenders and therefore overran a signal, causing the block the tender entered to be compromised. Originally, they were intended for use in the northeastern region, with their use later spreading across the network where heavy unfitted trains were in use. In the northeast, they usually found themselves propelled by the locomotives, with the opposite being the case on the southern region. Brake tenders would appear in a variety of liveries. However, under the corporate livery they would see themselves be painted all over rail blue. British Rail would cease use of brake tenders on service trains in 1973. However, some would be converted to departmental stock and survived into the early 80s. at this point having received their corporate blue paint. Sadly, not one was to make it into preservation, with all being repurposed by British Railways or meeting the cutter's torch. This was due to the fact that at this time preservation of diesels was in its infancy, and so locomotives were made the priority of rescuers. The last two were noted as awaiting the cutter's torch at Woodham's scrapyard in Barry in 1981, with the rest having met their fate a few years before. However, one operational replica has been built by the Great Central Railway in Leicestershire from remnants of a Mark I corridor coach, and can be seen today on occasion running alongside their diesel running stock. Whilst not the most illustrious or interesting piece of British Rail's operation, they should still be remembered as an important part of the infrastructure at a time when it was undergoing some of its biggest changes and challenges in its long and varied history. Thank you for watching, and if you've enjoyed this episode of Off the Rails, why not leave a like and consider subscribing so that you don't miss future videos.